At Thanksgiving dinner, my son-in-law threw a glass of wine at my daughter in front of 14 guests. "Get back in the kitchen. You and your father don't belong at this table," he shouted. The entire room went silent. I didn't yell. I didn't fight back. I simply removed my 40-year-old watch and placed it on the table. He laughed and asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You're about to find out who you just insulted." If this story already has your heart, welcome. I'm so grateful you're here with Revenge Dad today. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? What city, what country? Let's see how far this story travels. Please note, this story contains fictional elements created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to real names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is something worth keeping. There are mornings when a man sits alone in his kitchen and understands with absolute clarity exactly how much of his life has already been spent. Not with bitterness, not with regret, just with the particular stillness of someone who has counted the years honestly and made his peace with the number. This was one of those mornings. I had been up since 5. The coffee was already cold in my mug. I kept forgetting to drink it, kept getting distracted by the smell of wood chips on my hands, and the small box sitting on the kitchen table in front of me. I had finished it 3 nights ago, a puzzle box, hand-cut from a piece of white oak I had been saving for 2 years. 16 interlocking pieces, each one sanded smooth enough that a child's fingers could find the edges without getting a splinter. Lucas would figure it out. He always did. That boy had his grandmother's patience and her eyes the kind that saw the shape of things before other people noticed there was a shape at all. I ran my thumb along the lid one more time. There was a small notch on the left corner I had not been able to sand out completely. I had almost started over. Then I thought, no, leave it. Nothing worth keeping is ever perfectly smooth. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint ghost of sawdust. And outside the window, the November sky was pressing down low and gray over the yard. The oak tree at the back fence had gone completely bare. Its branches made a pattern against the sky that reminded me of something cracked glass maybe, or the lines on an old man's hands. My hands. I looked at them wrapped around the coffee mug. They were not the hands of the man I had been at 40. The knuckles were larger now. The skin had loosened across the back of them, the way skin does when it has spent too many decades in the weather. But the calluses were still there, not the soft, faded kind that belonged to a man who stopped working years ago. The real kind, earned and re-earned. On my left wrist, the watch caught the kitchen light. It was not an expensive watch. It never had been, even when I could have afforded to replace it a dozen times over. Brown leather strap worn thin at the buckle holes. A small crack in the crystal that had been there for 11 years. Sarah had clasped it around my wrist on the morning of our wedding 40 years ago, standing in the hallway of her parents' house in her white dress, with her hair pinned up and her hands trembling so badly she could barely work the clasp. "There," she had said, pressing her palm flat against my wrist when she finally got it. "Now you have to come back to me. You're wearing my best thing." I pressed my thumb against the crystal, now the way I had done every morning for 4 decades. "I'm still here," I told her, "the way I always did." Her photograph was on the shelf above the kitchen table, the one from the summer before she got sick, standing in the backyard with her arms crossed and her head thrown back, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. That was the photograph I had chosen, because it was the most like her, not the careful posed ones from holidays. The one where she had forgotten the camera was there. I checked the clock on the microwave. 7:43. I needed to leave by 8:15 to make it to Emily's by 10:30 before the first guests arrived. I had learned the hard way 2 Thanksgivings ago, that arriving after the guests was worse than not arriving at all. Derek had a way of positioning himself at the door when there was an audience. A handshake that lasted half a second too long. A smile that communicated to anyone watching exactly where I ranked in the order of this household. I pushed the chair back and carried my mug to the sink, poured the cold coffee out, rinsed the mug and set it upside down on the rack the way Sarah had always done, the way I had kept doing for 6 years, without thinking about it. Then I stood at the sink for a moment and looked out at the yard. When Emily was 7 years old, I had built her a swing set back there. 2 weekends of pulled muscle in my lower back, 17 trips to the hardware store. She had named the swings. The higher one was Thunder, and the lower one was Cloud. She rode Thunder until the seat wore out and had to be replaced. I replaced it twice. There was nothing back there now but the oak tree and the gray November light. "She's going to be fine," I said to the window to Sarah, to myself. I was not sure which. I put on my coat. I checked the buttons on the wooden box one more time, making sure the latch held. I picked it up carefully, the way you carry something made by hand, which is different from the way you carry something bought. There is a weight to handmade things that has nothing to do with the wood. I locked the front door behind me and walked to the truck. The drive would take 40 minutes, long enough to think, long enough to remember every reason I had promised myself I would hold my tongue today. Hold it the way I had held it for 3 years, the way I had trained myself to hold it, the way Sarah would have wanted. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, the house grew small. The oak tree, the kitchen window, the shelf where Sarah's photograph sat in the gray morning light. I had not been inside Emily's house in 4 months. She kept saying the timing was never right. The contractors were in, or Derek had a work function, or Lucas had a school thing. I told myself it was just the season. People got busy, families drifted, and then found their way back. But there was something sitting beneath that explanation, something heavier and less comfortable that I had been choosing not to look at directly. I looked at it now, doing 60 on the empty highway. The door I was about to walk through would not open the same way twice. 40 minutes of highway, and I pulled up to a house I had helped pay for without ever being asked if I wanted my name on the deed. I sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. Not because I was hesitating. I had stopped hesitating about this family a long time ago. I sat there because I wanted to look at it the way a stranger would just for a second. The iron gate, the Belgian block driveway, the maple trees lining both sides. Their leaves long gone, now their branches reaching up like hands with nothing left to hold. 3 cars already parked along the curb, a black Audi, a silver Mercedes, a Range Rover with a personalized plate that read, Cold Ev, Collins Development. Derek had ordered that plate the week his company crossed its first million in revenue and had been telling that story at dinner parties ever since. I picked up the puzzle box from the passenger seat, tucked it under my arm, and got out of the truck. The front walk was heated. I could feel it through the soles of my boots, the slight give of pavement that never ices over. Emily had mentioned it once casually, the way people mention things that have become ordinary to them. Derek had it installed 2 winters ago. I remembered thinking, that is a thing a man does when he has stopped remembering what cold feels like. I pressed the doorbell. 15 seconds, I counted them, then 20. Then the sound of footsteps, quick, uneven, the footsteps of someone moving faster than they meant to. The door swung open, and Emily was standing there in a cream-colored dress with her hair swept up. And for just a moment, one single gut-punching moment, she looked exactly like her mother at 38. Same jaw, same way of holding her chin up slightly when she was nervous. My chest tightened so hard I had to breathe through it carefully, the way you breathe through pain you have learned not to show. "Dad," she stepped forward and hugged me. It was a real hug, arms around my neck, her face pressed briefly against my shoulder, but it was also fast. The hug of a woman checking the room behind her while she was doing it. "I'm so glad you made it. Come in, it's freezing." "Emily," I held on for an extra second before she pulled back. "You look beautiful." Her smile flickered grateful and strained at the same time, like a candle in a draft. "The Hendersons are already here," she said, stepping aside to let me through. "And the Marshalls. Derek's been—" She stopped, rearranged whatever she had been about to say. "It's been a full morning." Before I could respond, something slammed into my midsection at approximately the force and speed of a golden retriever. "Grandpa," Lucas had his arms locked around my waist, his face buried in my coat, already laughing at some joke only he understood. I grabbed him with my free arm and held on, and the tightness in my chest loosened just slightly, just enough. "Hey, buddy." I pressed my hand against the back of his head, feeling the warmth of him. "You got taller." He pulled back and looked up at me with those serious gray eyes that had never belonged on a 10-year-old's face. "I grew 1.5 inches since August." Mom measured me on the doorframe. Then his eyes found the box under my arm and went wide. "Is that for me?" "Depends on whether you've been practicing your patience." He grabbed my free hand with both of his and started pulling me toward the living room. I really have. Ask Mom. I'll take your word for it." Emily touched my arm as we passed her, a small gesture, 2 fingers against my sleeve, there and gone. I did not know at the time how many things that small touch was trying to say. The living room hit me the way it always did, like walking into a magazine that had learned to breathe. Every surface was deliberate. The white sofa with its geometric throw pillows, the 6-foot floral arrangement on the entry table, real flowers, not faux. Emily's one insistence in a house that otherwise bore Derek's fingerprints on every surface. The Thanksgiving tablescape visible through the wide archway, linen napkins folded into shapes I could not name, candles at staggered heights, a centerpiece involving dried wheat and small white pumpkins that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. And then Derek. He came in from the far side of the living room, unhurried hands in the pockets of his charcoal trousers, a glass of red wine already in one hand at 10:30 in the morning. He was a handsome man. I had always been honest enough with myself to acknowledge that. Broad shoulders, square jaw, the kind of silver starting at his temples that magazines called distinguished. He wore it all the way, other men wore a uniform. William. He crossed the room and extended his hand. The handshake was firm, practiced the exact pressure of a man who had read a book about handshakes once and never forgotten it. Glad you could make it. Not glad you're here. Not good to see you. Glad you could make it, the greeting you give a contractor who showed up on time. Derek. I matched his grip and let go first. Place looks great. Emily's work, he said, with the particular generosity of a man taking credit by disclaiming it. He glanced at the box under my arm. What's that? Something for Lucas. Derek looked at Lucas, who was still attached to my left hand. Bud, why don't you go check on the appetizers for Mom? Lucas looked up at me. First a quick instinctive check, the kind a child does when he has learned that the adults in his life do not always mean the same thing as each other. I gave him a small nod. He let go of my hand and headed toward the kitchen, but not before he looked back once over his shoulder with those gray eyes that missed nothing. I set the puzzle box down on the side table near the entrance next to a bottle of wine displayed on a small stand like a piece of sculpture. The label was French, the bottle was the kind with a wax seal. It cost, I estimated, somewhere between $400 and $800. My box sat next to it, unvarnished oak, slightly irregular, with one small notch on the left corner I had not been able to sand out. I looked at them side by side for just a moment. Then I followed Derek into the living room to meet the people who had no idea yet who I was. The wall at the far end stopped me where I stood. Photographs, floor to ceiling in mismatched frames the way designers do it, now carefully mismatched, expensively casual. Emily and Derek on a beach in what looked like Tuscany. Lucas at a ski resort, goggles pushed up on his forehead. A family Christmas photo from 2 years ago, everyone in coordinating burgundy. Derek at what appeared to be a charity gala, arm around a man I recognized from the business pages. I scanned the wall twice, carefully, the way I used to scan job sites for structural problems, looking for what was not there rather than what was. There was not one photograph of Emily before Derek, not one photograph that included me, not even the framed snapshot Emily had kept on her college dorm dresser for 4 years, the one of the two of us at her high school graduation, her cap tilted sideways, both of us laughing so hard we were barely standing. That photograph existed somewhere in this house. I had to believe that. But it was not on this wall. My jaw tightened. I loosened it deliberately, the way I used to control my breathing on difficult days on the job when things were going wrong and I needed every person around me to believe they were going right. William. Derek's voice pulled me back. He was gesturing toward the cluster of guests near the fireplace. Come meet some people. I turned away from the wall. Sure, I said, and I carried the weight of what I had just seen into the center of that beautiful airless room. The guests arrived in waves, expensive coats, louder laughs, the kind of people who shake hands and immediately calculate what you are worth to them. I had positioned myself near the window with Lucas, which suited me fine. From there, I could see the whole room without being in the middle of it. The way I used to position myself on job sites, back to a solid wall, clear sight lines in every direction. Old habits do not retire when the man does. Lucas had the puzzle box in his lap and was already working at it. With both thumbs, his forehead creased in concentration that would have looked severe on anyone older than 12. You're going about it wrong, I told him. He looked up, affronted. I've only been trying for 2 minutes, Grandpa. 2 minutes is long enough to know you're going about it wrong. He narrowed his eyes at me, and then, despite himself, grinned. Fine. How? Don't push. Feel for where it wants to go. He looked back at the box and tried again, this time with his fingertips instead of his thumbs. 3 seconds later, the first panel shifted. His mouth dropped open. How did you know that? Because I made it, I said. I know every piece of it. He stared at the box for a moment, then looked up at me with those serious gray eyes. Did you make things like this when you were working big things? Bigger, I said. Like what? I thought about how to answer that. 37 completed projects, 400 employees at our peak, the Millbrook Bridge renovation that had made the front page of the State Business Journal. Buildings mostly, I said. Roads, a few bridges. Lucas considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. That's cooler than a puzzle box. Don't tell the puzzle box that. It's sensitive. He burst out laughing, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that embarrassed him a little because it was too loud for the room. He clapped a hand over his mouth and looked around to see if his father had heard. Derek was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by 3 men in blazers who leaned in slightly when he spoke the way people do, around someone they have decided is important. His voice carried across the room, not because he was loud, but because he had trained it to carry. I had noticed that about Derek in the early years. He had trained everything about himself, the voice, the handshake, the laugh that arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Emily came through the archway carrying a tray of stuffed mushrooms, moving with the efficient grace of a woman who had learned to be useful in her own home rather than comfortable in it. She caught my eye from across the room and smiled the same flickering smile from the doorway there and gone. I smiled back wider than I felt, and she moved on toward the cluster of women near the bar cart. I watched Derek watch her go. There was something in the way he tracked her movement, not with warmth, not even with the possessiveness of a jealous man. More like an inventory check. She was where she was supposed to be doing what she was supposed to do. He looked away before she turned back around, my back teeth pressed together. Grandpa, Lucas tugged my sleeve. There's a name card on the table over there. It says Henry Walker. Who's Henry Walker? I looked across the room at the long dining table visible through the archway. Sure enough, at the far end, a small ivory card in a silver holder. Henry Walker. The sight of the name made something loosen in my chest, unexpectedly the way a knot loosens when you find exactly the right angle. An old friend, I said. Your friend or Dad's friend? Mine. The word came out more firmly than I intended. Definitely mine. Lucas seemed to find this satisfying. He went back to the puzzle box, working at the second panel now, with new patience. I kept my eyes on the room. A man in his mid-50s detached himself from the group near the bar and made his way over the sociable kind who worked every corner of a party, methodically collecting conversations like business cards. Bill Wright? He extended his hand. Mike Henderson. Derek's told me a lot about you. I shook it. William? And I doubt that. Henderson laughed, uncertain whether I was joking. Retired, I hear. That's right. What field? Before I could answer, Derek materialized at Henderson's shoulder, the way he had a talent for doing always where the conversation was always at exactly the right moment. Construction, Derek said with a smile aimed at Henderson rather than me. Local stuff back in the day. William kept things running at the regional level for a long time. He clapped Henderson on the back. Mike, you have to hear about the Riverside project we just closed. Come on. He steered Henderson away smoothly without looking back at me once. Not once. Lucas had gone very still beside me. I looked down at him. He was staring at the space where Derek had been standing, the puzzle box, forgotten in his lap, his small jaw set in a way that reminded me so sharply of Emily at his age that my throat tightened. Dad does that a lot, he said. Not a question, not a complaint. Just a fact stated plainly the way children state facts when they have been observing something long enough to be certain of it. Does what? I asked, though I already knew. Lucas looked up at me. His voice dropped not out of secrecy, but out of the natural instinct of someone saying something true in a room full of people who have agreed not to say true things. Talks about you like you're not standing right there. My chest cracked open on a hairline fracture, clean and quiet, the kind of break that does not bleed right away. People get busy at parties, I said carefully. It's a lot to manage. Lucas looked at me for a long moment. He had his grandmother's instinct for knowing when he was being given an answer instead of the truth. But he was also 10 and he loved me, and so he let it go. He went back to the puzzle box. The second panel slid free with a small, satisfying click. Grandpa, he said without looking up. Why doesn't Dad ever look at you when you're talking? The question landed in the center of my sternum like a stone dropped into still water. rings spreading outward, quiet and unstoppable. I put my hand on the back of his head, warm, solid, the most real thing in the room. Some grown-ups, I said, have a lot on their minds. He nodded slowly, accepting this, turning the puzzle box over in his hands. And I sat there beside my grandson in the corner of my daughter's beautiful, expensive, airless home, with the weight of his question settling into me like something I had been carrying for years without knowing it had a name. Across the room, Derek threw his head back and laughed at something Henderson had said. The sound filled every corner. Something in that room was building towards something. Something in that room was building towards something. I had felt it the moment I walked through the iron gate. The way Derek's eyes moved. The way Emily's smile never quite reached. The way Lucas asked the questions that adults in this house had agreed, without ever saying so, never to ask. I had promised myself I would hold my tongue today, but a man can only keep a promise if the other people in the room hold up their end of it too. They called us to dinner at 1:30, and the dining room received us the way a stage receives its actors, with an audience already in place and the lighting arranged for maximum effect. The table was 14 feet of reclaimed oak. I knew the wood by sight, could have told you the grain came from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Dressed in ivory linen with candles at 3 heights, and a centerpiece of dried wheat-white pumpkins, and what appeared to be actual gold leaf pressed into the gourds. I did the math in my head before I could stop myself. The centerpiece alone had probably cost $400. The flowers on the entry table, another 3. The wine I had counted on the sideboard, 8 bottles, none of them under 60. This was not a Thanksgiving dinner. This was a performance of wealth for an audience of people who already had it. I found my place card at the far end of the table, end seat closest to the kitchen door. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. William Carter and Emily's handwriting, careful, slightly slanted, the same handwriting she had used on her school projects when she was 9 years old. She had put me here herself. Whether Derek had told her to, or whether she had simply understood without being told where I was expected to sit, I did not know. Both possibilities hurt in different ways. I pulled out the chair and sat down. Well, I'll be. The voice came from directly across the table, warm and dry, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years finding things genuinely funny. I looked up. Henry Walker was settling into the chair opposite me, adjusting his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that he did not need to rush for anyone. He was 70 years old and looked it without apology. Silver hair, deep-set eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that had earned its lines. He looked at me across the ivory linen and the gold-leafed pumpkins and grinned like we were sharing a joke that no one else in the room had heard yet. "Bill Carter," he said. "Last time I saw you, you were pouring concrete in a hard hat at 6 in the morning. Something in my chest loosened genuinely unexpectedly, the way a fist unclenches when the crisis passes. Henry." I leaned forward and we shook hands across the centerpiece. "What on earth are you doing here? Margaret Henderson is my wife's college roommate." He waved a hand. "You know how these things work. 1 degree of separation, and suddenly you're eating turkey with strangers." His eyes moved quick and assessing around the table. "Though I'm starting to think not everyone here is a stranger to each other." "Small world," I said. "Getting smaller." He looked at me steadily. His voice dropped half a register, just enough for the table noise to cover it. "How long have you been sitting at the end of the table, Bill?" I glanced down at my place card. "Just sat down." "That's not what I mean." I met his eyes. He had always been direct. It was the thing I had liked most about him, and the thing that had occasionally made working with him complicated. Henry Walker said the thing that was true and let you figure out how to feel about it afterward. "A while," I said. He nodded, slow and serious. Then Lucas dropped into the seat beside me, slightly out of breath, still clutching the puzzle box, and the conversation shifted. "Grandpa, I got the second panel." He held the box up. 2 of the 16 pieces had been released, leaving a small gap in the surface. "I did it the way you said, feeling instead of pushing." "Good man." I examined the gap with appropriate gravity. 6 more panels before anything interesting happens." Lucas groaned theatrically. "How many total?" 16. "Grandpa." "Patience," I said. "Remember." He groaned again, but settled in beside me, working at the box with renewed determination. At the head of the table, Derek stood. He picked up his wine glass, the crystal caught the candlelight, and threw small, bright shapes across the linen and looked down the length of the table at the assembled guests with the satisfied expression of a man surveying something he owns. "Before we eat," Derek said, his voice warming and expanding to fill the room, the way I had noticed it always did when he had an audience large enough to justify the effort. "I want to say how grateful I am to have the people who matter most gathered here." He paused, smiled. "The people who built something with their lives, who understand what it means to earn a seat at the table." He let the phrase land. Earn a seat at the table. His eyes moved down the room, collecting faces, gauging reactions the way a performer checks the house. They passed over me at the end without stopping. Not a glance. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I was furniture. Expensive furniture maybe, but furniture nonetheless. Across from me, Henry Walker set his wine glass down, with a small, precise click. "Does he know," Henry said low, and leveled his eyes still on Derek, "who he just said that in front of—" I watched Derek raise his glass higher, drawing the room into a toast. "Not yet," I said. Henry looked at me then. Something moved through his expression. Recognition, maybe, or the particular alertness of a man who has just understood the shape of a situation that other people are still mistaking for something ordinary. "And you want to keep it that way," he said, "for now?" He studied me for another moment. Then he picked his wine glass back up slowly and turned to join the toast with everyone else. But before he did, he said one more thing quietly enough that only I could have heard it. "Bill, how long has this been going on?" I lifted my water glass, not the wine. I had not touched the wine, and joined the toast. "Long enough," I said. The crystal rang out around the table. 14 people drinking to something Derek had named for them, in a room Derek had built for exactly this purpose on a day Derek had chosen to use. I drank my water. Lucas pressed his knee against my leg under the table, not deliberately, just the natural closeness of a child who trusted the person beside him without needing a reason. I pressed back, and at the head of the table, Derek began to talk about the people who had earned their place in the world, and his voice carried the full, warm, practiced confidence of a man who had never once doubted that he was one of them. The food came out perfect. Everything Derek Collins touched in public was always perfect. That was the thing about him. He understood instinctively that power is mostly theater, and he had spent years perfecting his production. The turkey had been dry-brined for 48 hours. I knew this because Emily had mentioned it on the phone 2 weeks ago, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone recounting a process that had been decided for her. The mashed potatoes were whipped with truffle oil. The green beans had been flown in from somewhere that apparently grew better green beans than the state of Virginia. Derek had told the table this fact within the first 90 seconds of food arriving, with the casual pride of a man who expected to be thanked for it. "You know what the secret to a great Thanksgiving is," Derek said, lifting his fork with the air of a professor beginning a lecture. He looked around the table, not at me. Never at me, unless he needed something from the direction I was sitting. "Standards. Most people settle. They buy the pre-basted bird from the grocery store, crack open a can of cranberry sauce." He chuckled. "Nothing wrong with that, if that's your ceiling." Mike Henderson laughed appreciatively. The woman beside him, his wife Margaret, smiled with her mouth closed. Henry Walker cut a piece of turkey with great concentration and said nothing. I ate my food and watched Derek the way I used to watch weather systems moving in from the west, tracking the pressure, reading the rotation, calculating how long before it made landfall. "William?" Derek's voice swung toward me with the precision of a searchlight. "I have to ask, how do you manage living out there in, where is it, Fairfax plus Reston?" I said. "Reston?" He repeated it the way people repeat the names of places they consider beneath comment. "How do you manage the holidays out there on your own? Must be quiet." "I like quiet," I said. Sure. He nodded slowly, performing sympathy for the table. "Emily worries, you know. We both do. A man your age alone in a house that size." He shook his head. "It's a lot of upkeep for one person." My jaw tightened, my back molars pressed flat together. I kept my voice the same temperature it had been all afternoon, level, unhurried, giving him nothing to work with. "House is fine, Derek. Been keeping it up for 30 years. Muscle memory at this point." Derek smiled at Henderson. "That's what I love about William. Stubborn in a charming way." He raised his glass slightly, a mock toast. "The older generation. They built things to last." The word older landed with surgical precision. Not grandfather, not the older generation. The older generation, Derek's generation, sitting at the head of the table, and the remainder up here at the end, near the kitchen door, eating truffle mashed potatoes he had not been consulted about. My right hand found my water glass. I gripped it, not tightly, just enough to have something solid to hold on to. Across the table, Henry Walker looked at me over the rim of his wine glass. One eyebrow moved barely perceptibly. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. Emily came through the kitchen door with a fresh basket of rolls and set it on the table near Lucas, who grabbed one immediately with both hands. She straightened up and caught the tail end of something in the room, the particular atmospheric pressure of a conversation that had just finished being about something it was pretending not to be about. Her eyes found mine, then Derek's, then the table. "More wine, anyone?" she asked. "Please," said Margaret Henderson, holding out her glass with the gratitude of a woman who had also been reading the room. Derek leaned back in his chair, expanding into the extra space the way men do when they feel a room tilting in their direction. "You know what I always say about retirement?" He addressed this to Henderson, but his voice was calibrated to carry the full length of the table. "It's only restful if you've earned it. Otherwise, it's just stopping." He paused for effect. "There's a difference between a man who retires and a man who simply runs out of runway." The table went very slightly quieter. Lucas looked up from his roll butter on his chin, eyes moving from his father to his grandfather, with the radar of a child who had learned to monitor exactly this frequency. Lucas looked up from his roll butter on his chin, eyes moving from his father to his grandfather, with the radar of a child who had learned to monitor exactly this frequency. He opened his mouth, I felt it coming, and I put my hand on his arm before the words arrived. Gentle, firm, the pressure that meant not yet. He closed his mouth, but his eyes stayed on his father for 3 long seconds, and in those 3 seconds there was more clarity and more judgment than anything said at that table all afternoon. A bead of silence fell over that section of the table, the kind that has weight to it. Derek's smile thinned by a fraction, not enough for anyone to point to, just enough for me to see. Pictures aren't the same as results, are they, bud? You'll understand that when you're older. Lucas opened his mouth. I put my hand on his arm, gentle, firm, the pressure that meant not here, and he understood it. Because we had a language the two of us built out of fishing trips and woodshop afternoons and all the quiet time his parents had been too busy to fill. He closed his mouth, but his eyes stayed on his father for 3 long seconds. And in those 3 seconds there was more clarity and more judgment than anything said at that table all afternoon. I looked down at my plate. In my chest, something that had been held carefully in place for 3 years shifted just slightly, just a fraction of an inch the way a foundation shifts, before anyone on the surface knows there is a problem. I picked up my fork, I ate my truffle potatoes. I listened to Derek pivot smoothly back to Henderson, and a story about a development deal in Phoenix that had tripled its projected returns. But I was no longer counting the way I had been counting before I had been counting to stay calm. Now I was counting for a different reason, the way you count footsteps in a dark building, not to soothe yourself, but to know exactly where you are. Derek refilled his wine glass for the 3rd time. His eyes moved around the table after each remark at my expense, collecting reactions, reading faces, checking his inventory. He was not done. He had never intended to stop here. Whatever this afternoon was building toward, he had sketched the blueprint long before I had pulled into his driveway. I pressed my thumb against the face of Sarah's watch, and I waited. There is a particular cruelty in being humiliated slowly in small doses in front of people who are too polite or too frightened to say anything. I had watched it happen to other men over the years, on job sites, in boardrooms, at city council meetings, where developers with expensive lawyers talked over contractors who had actually built the things being discussed. I had never thought I would be sitting at a dinner table watching it happen to myself. But there I was, 2:30 in the afternoon, Thanksgiving Day, with sweet potato casserole going cold on my plate and Derek Collins warming up for his 3rd act. "You know what the problem with this country is?" Derek announced to no one in particular, which meant he was announcing it to everyone. He swirled his wine, the 4th glass I had counted, and leaned back with the posture of a man who had decided the room needed his opinion. "We stopped valuing ambition. We started treating comfort like an achievement." He looked around the table. Comfort is not an achievement. Comfort is what happens when you stop trying. "Hear, hear," said Henderson, who I was beginning to think agreed with everything Derek said on principle. "The men who built this country, Derek continued warming to it. Now the way he always warmed when he had an audience and enough wine were not comfortable men. They were hungry. They were driven. He set his glass down and looked directly at me for the first time in 20 minutes. No offense, William. I'm speaking generally. My chest contracted. My fingers tightened around my fork handle, not because I was angry not yet, but because the body registers insults before the mind decides what to do about them. And mine had been registering this one building all afternoon. None taken, I said. My voice came out even. I was proud of that. It's just, Derek tilted his head, performing thoughtfulness. Emily always says her dad was a hard worker, and I believe it. I do. But there's a difference between working hard and building something that outlasts you, between effort and legacy. He smiled at me. You understand the distinction, I'm sure. The table had gone quiet, not the comfortable quiet of people eating. The held breath quiet of people watching something they did not know how to stop. Emily was gripping the stem of her wineglass so tightly her knuckles had gone the color of the linen tablecloth. Her lips pressed together in a line so thin it almost disappeared. She looked at her husband, then at the table, then at some middle distance that was in neither. Henry Walker set down his fork with a quiet, deliberate click that made the woman beside him flinch slightly. He folded his hands on the table. His jaw was doing something that I recognized, the particular tension of a man holding back something that very much wants to come out. And then Lucas spoke. Dad. His voice was clear and steady, the voice he used when he was absolutely certain of something. He had put the puzzle box down on his lap and was looking directly at his father across the table. Grandpa's buildings are still standing. I looked them up. Derek looked at his son. What? I looked them up online. Lucas reached into the pocket of his chinos and produced his phone, small, slightly battered, the case covered in stickers of animals. The Millbrook Bridge renovation, it's on the county website. It says Carter's Construction. That's Grandpa's company. He looked at the screen, reading carefully. It says the project came in under budget and ahead of schedule, and it's been recognized as, he sounded out the word carefully, as a regional infrastructure landmark. The table was absolutely motionless. Derek's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did a flicker fast and dark, like a light being switched off in a back room. That's great research, buddy, he said, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to compliment a macaroni art project. Very thorough. It also says, Lucas continued, his eyes still on the phone, his voice gaining the particular unstoppable quality of a child who is prepared for this, that Carter Construction employed over 400 people at its peak, and that the founder sold the company to honor a family commitment. He looked up at his father. That means Grandpa sold it to take care of Grandma when she was sick. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in a dining room. My eyes burned. I pressed my back teeth together so hard my jaw ached. I would not cry at this table. I would not give Derek Collins the satisfaction of watching me come undone over the words of a 10-year-old boy who had done his homework on his grandfather because no one else in this house had bothered. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes glistened. She looked at Lucas, then at me, and the expression on her face, the grief and the love and the shame, all colliding at once, nearly broke every promise I had made to myself about staying composed. Lucas. Derek's voice had dropped an octave. The warmth was entirely gone. Put the phone away. I'm just saying I said put it away. Lucas looked at his father. His chin came up, and I saw Emily and him so clearly in that moment, it felt like looking through time. He put the phone in his pocket slowly without looking away from Derek's face. The information is still true, Lucas said quietly. Even if I put the phone away. I reached over and put my hand on my grandson's shoulder. He was trembling, not with fear, I realized, but with the effort of holding his ground. 10 years old and already made of better material than most of the men at that table. Hey, I said low enough for just him. You did good. I just said what was true, he whispered back. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that small crack in his voice did more damage to my composure than anything Derek had said all afternoon. That's all you ever need to do, I told him. Across the table, Henry Walker looked at me. His eyes were steady and serious, and carried something in them that I had not seen directed at me in a very long time, the particular look of a man who is waiting for you to decide what kind of man you are going to be in the next 10 minutes. And in the back of my mind, quiet and certain, as groundwater, I felt 3 years of careful silence beginning to crack along every seam. They cleared the main course with the efficiency of people who are paid to make discomfort invisible, and for a few minutes the movement of plates and the arrival of coffee gave everyone in that room a reason to look somewhere other than at each other. I pushed back from the table and walked to the far side of the living room, toward the tall windows that looked out over the backyard. The grass was the deep chemical green of sod that had never been allowed to go dormant. A pair of wrought iron chairs sat on the stone patio, perfectly placed, never used. Beyond them, a 6-foot privacy fence ran the full perimeter, no gaps, no knotholes, no sight lines to the neighbors. Everything in Derek Collins' world was managed, contained, optimized for the appearance of perfection. I heard Henry Walker's footsteps behind me before he spoke, unhurried, deliberate. "Hell of an afternoon," he said, coming to stand beside me at the window. "It's not over yet," I said. Henry looked out at the yard. His reflection floated in the glass beside mine, 2 old men with white hair and the particular posture of people who had stopped caring what they looked like to rooms full of strangers. He turned his coffee cup slowly in both hands, the way men do when they are choosing their words carefully. "How long has he been doing that to you?" he asked. "Doing what?" Henry gave me the look that question deserved. "Bill, I have known you for 35 years. Do not make me list it out like evidence at a deposition." My chest tightened painfully. 3 years, I said, since about 6 months after the wedding. Henry exhaled through his nose a long, controlled breath that carried a full paragraph of opinion in it. "And Emily?" I looked at my reflection in the glass, the lines around my eyes, the gray at my temples that Sarah used to run her fingers through and called distinguished, which I had always suspected was her being generous. "She manages," I said, "the way women manage things when they have decided that keeping the peace is the same as keeping the family." "It's not the same thing." "No," I agreed. "It's not." Henry set his coffee cup down on the windowsill and turned to face me properly. His eyes were sharp and steady behind his glasses, the eyes of a man who had spent a career reading contracts for the things not written in them. "I did some checking after Emily's wedding," he said, "when I found out who she had married. I wanted to know what kind of man Derek Collins was before he had money. And when Margaret mentioned 3 weeks ago that the Thanksgiving host was a Derek Collins development, I pulled the county records before I RSVP'd. Something cold moved through my chest. And I found out some things that I imagine you already know." He kept his voice low, even below the noise of the room behind us. "His first development deal, the one that made his name, a mixed-use project in Alexandria, $2.4 million in seed funding when he was 32 years old, and every bank in the region had already told him no." He looked at me steadily. "I found the original investor agreement in the county records, the silent partner." He paused. "It was you, wasn't it?" It was not a question. Henry had never wasted a question mark on something he already knew. I looked out at the managed green lawn and the wrought iron chairs that no one ever sat in. "Emily loved him," I said. That felt like reason enough at the time. Henry's jaw tightened visibly. A muscle jumped along the side of his face, once controlled the physical equivalent of a man swallowing something bitter. "He doesn't know," Henry said. "Does he?" "He knew," I said, "at the beginning. He sent a thank you note, handwritten, very gracious." I pressed my thumb against the face of my watch. By the 2nd year of the marriage, I think he had convinced himself the money had come from somewhere else. People have a talent for rewriting their own history when the original version is inconvenient. Henry stared at me for a long moment. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was running numbers in his head, the rapid, almost invisible flicker of a man calculating something with a lot of variables. "Bill," he said, "there's more." My stomach dropped a physical sensation, sudden and cold, the kind that belongs to phone calls at 3 in the morning and envelopes from lawyers. "Tell me." "Collins development." Henry's voice went quieter still. 3 consecutive quarters in the red. "I have a contact at First Federal, nothing improper, just information that's technically public if you know where to look. 2 bridge loans from private lenders, high interest, short term." He looked at me directly. "He is not a wealthy man, Bill. He is a man performing wealth while the floor dissolves underneath him." The room behind us hummed with the sounds of dessert being arranged, and Derek's voice riding above it all, still warm, still confident, still working the room. I listened to that voice and felt something in my understanding of this afternoon rearrange itself the way the image in a kaleidoscope rearranges when you rotate the tube, all the same pieces suddenly making a completely different picture. He needed money. He had always needed money. And the man he had been systematically humiliating in front of his wealthy friends for the past 3 hours was the same man who had handed him his entire career on a signature. "Does Emily know any of this?" Henry asked. My throat closed around the answer before I could say it. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose the way I had breathed through pain for 68 years. "I don't think she knows the extent of it," I said. "She knows things are not. I've seen the way she counts before she speaks sometimes. The way careful people count when they are not sure there is enough." Henry nodded slowly. He picked his coffee cup back up, wrapped both hands around it. "What are you going to do?" I looked at my reflection in the glass one more time. The old man looking back at me had calloused hands and a cracked watch crystal and 37 completed projects to his name. He had poured concrete in hard hats at 6 in the morning and signed payroll for 400 families and held his wife's hand through 2 years of chemotherapy without once letting her see how frightened he was. He was not a man who ran out of runway. "I'm going to let it play out," I said. "For now." Henry looked at me sidelong. "And when now is over?" Before I could answer, Derek's voice cut through the low hum of conversation from across the room, louder than before, sharpened with the particular edge of a man who had had too much wine and not enough resistance. I heard my name in it. I heard the laughter that followed it. Henry looked at me. I looked at the lawn. "I think," I said quietly, "that now might be ending sooner than I planned. There is a moment in every gathering where the alcohol and the audience combine into something genuinely dangerous. I had seen it happen in boardrooms when a negotiation turned personal. I had seen it on job sites when a foreman with too much authority and not enough sleep started making decisions that endangered people. I had learned to recognize the particular atmospheric pressure of that moment, the way the air in a room changes the way voices get slightly too loud, the way eyes start moving differently. Walking back into that living room, I felt it the second I crossed the threshold. Derek was holding court near the fireplace again, but something had shifted in his posture since dinner. The studied ease was gone. His shoulders were drawn up slightly, his gestures wider than they needed to be. His voice pitched to carry in a way that had stopped being sociable and started being something else. The fourth glass of wine had become a fifth. I could see it in the particular brightness of his eyes, not warm, not happy. Electric. The brightness of a live wire. "And there he is," Derek said, and the way he said it, the timing, the slight pause before the way every head in the room turned toward me when he spoke told me that whatever he had been saying before I walked back in, it had been about me. My jaw set. I walked into the room without changing my pace and took my seat near the window. Henry settled in beside me close enough that I could hear the controlled steadiness of his breathing. "We were just talking about legacy," Derek announced to the room at large. He was smiling, but the smile had shed its social purpose entirely. It was a different animal, now sharper, hungrier, the smile of a man who had decided to stop pretending. About what a man leaves behind, what he builds, what actually lasts. He looked directly at me. "William, I want to ask you something, man to man, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." Every nerve in my body went very still. This was the moment. I had felt it coming since the driveway, since the place card at the end of the table, since the first no offense that had been loaded with nothing but offense. "Go ahead," I said. Derek set his wineglass down on the mantelpiece and crossed his arms. The firelight threw the shadow of him long across the floor toward me. "What is it exactly that you contribute to this family, to Emily's life?" He tilted his head, the performance of genuine curiosity. "Because, from where I'm standing, I see a man who worked a regional construction job, sold it, and has been living in a house that's too big for one person for the past 6 years. Meanwhile, Emily, my wife, carries the weight of maintaining a relationship with someone who shows up twice a year, eats the food we provide, and then drives back to Reston." He spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm asking a genuine question. What do you contribute?" The room was absolutely motionless. Margaret Henderson had pressed herself back into her armchair, as though hoping it would absorb her. Mike Henderson was studying the carpet with sudden intense interest. 2 other couples near the bar cart had gone the particular rigid stillness of people who desperately want to be somewhere else and have no mechanism for leaving. Lucas had gone white. He was standing near the hallway entrance with his puzzle box clutched to his chest, his knuckles pale, his eyes enormous and fixed on his grandfather, with an expression that cracked something open, deep in my sternum. And Emily. Emily came through the kitchen door at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one, depending on how you measured these things. She was carrying a plate of desserts, and she stopped dead in the archway, the plate tilting slightly in her hands as she took in the room and understood in the way that people who have lived with a particular kind of tension always understand exactly what she had just walked into. She set the plate down on the sideboard. Her hands were shaking. I could see it from across the room, the fine tremor in her fingers as she pressed them flat against the sideboard surface to steady herself. Derek. Her voice came out low and taut, the voice of a wire pulled too tight. That's enough. He turned to look at his wife. Something moved across his face, surprise maybe that she had spoken at all. Then the surprise became something colder. Emily, I'm having a conversation. You're humiliating my father in front of our guests. Her chin was up. Her voice had stopped shaking. And I am asking you to stop. Sweetheart, don't. The word came out sharp as a struck match. Don't sweetheart me in front of 14 people like I'm a child who doesn't understand what's happening. The room held its breath. Derek looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he looked around the room at the guests at Henderson, at the faces turned toward this confrontation, with the helpless fascination of people watching a car accident from the highway. He calculated. I could see him doing it. The math of a man weighing his options against his audience. Then he looked back at Emily and said very quietly, so quietly, that half the room probably did not hear it. Sit down. Emily flinched. It was small, a single involuntary contraction of her shoulders, the physical memory of 1,000 previous moments, that I was only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of. And then she did something that broke my heart more completely than anything Derek had said all afternoon. She sat down. Not quickly, not with defeat written plainly on her face. She sat with the terrible practiced dignity of a woman who had learned to make compliance look like a choice. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the middle distance, but her hands folded in her lap were trembling so hard I could see it from where I sat. Henry Walker made a sound beside me, very low, barely audible, the sound a man makes when he has seen something he cannot unsee and is deciding what to do about it. I looked down at my left hand resting on my knee, at the watch on my wrist, at the cracked crystal catching the firelight. In my chest, the thing that had been shifting and cracking all afternoon made one final decisive movement. It was not anger. Anger is hot and fast and loud, and what I felt was none of those things. What I felt was cold and clear and absolute, the particular clarity of a man who has finally, after a very long time, run out of reasons to wait. I reached up. I undid the buckle on the leather strap. I felt the familiar weight of the watch lift from my wrist for the first time in 40 years. I set it on the table in front of me, face up, the cracked crystal catching the light. Everyone thought I was getting ready to leave. I could see it moving through the room, the small exhales, the almost imperceptible relaxing of shoulders. The old man was going to walk away and spare them all the ugliness of whatever came next. I let them think that, because what I was actually doing had nothing to do with leaving. Before I tell you what Derek did next, the moment that changed everything in that room forever, I need to know if you're still with me. If you've ever watched someone you love being slowly diminished by the person who was supposed to protect them, drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just the number 9, so I know you're here, and so I know this story is reaching the people who need it most. And a quick note before we continue, parts of what follows contain certain fictional elements woven in to bring this story to life. If that's not something you're comfortable with, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, hold on, because what happens next will change everything. The room had gone very still, the kind of still that happens right before something breaks, not the peaceful stillness of a winter morning, but the pressurized stillness of a structure pushed past its load-bearing limit, every joint and beam at maximum tolerance, waiting for the single point of failure. I had set the watch on the table in front of me. The cracked crystal caught the firelight and threw a small, pale reflection onto the linen tablecloth. Every person in that room was watching me with the held breath attention of people who had convinced themselves they were about to be spared something ugly. They were wrong about that. Emily had been watching her husband with the particular expression of a woman who has swallowed the same thing so many times that her throat has finally closed around it. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Her jaw was set. When she spoke, her voice came from somewhere deeper than her chest, from somewhere that had been gathering itself for a long time. "Derek," she pushed back her chair and stood. "That is enough. You have said enough tonight." He turned to look at her. The firelight played across his face, and what moved through his eyes in that fraction of a second made every hair on my arm stand up. Not anger, not yet. Calculation. The rapid, cold calculation of a man deciding how much the situation required. "Emily?" His voice went soft in the way that soft voices go soft when they are not soft at all. "Sit back down." "No." Her chin came up. Her voice did not shake. "No, I will not sit back down. You have spent this entire afternoon treating my father like he is invisible, like he is nothing, like everything he has ever done, and sacrifice does not exist, and I am done pretending I do not see it." The room held its breath. Derek looked at his wife. He looked around the room, at the faces turned toward them. Henderson, the marshals, the couples near the bar cart. Henry pressed against the wall, with his hands very still at his sides. He calculated one more time, and then he reached out, picked up the wine glass from the mantelpiece, and threw it directly at Emily's face. The burgundy red exploded across her cheek and forehead in a single violent burst. The wine ran down her nose, her chin dripped from her jaw onto the ivory tablecloth in dark, spreading drops. The shattered crystal hit the sideboard behind her and broke apart across the floor with a sound that cut through every remaining pretense in that room. High, irreversible, the sound of something that could not be taken back. Emily did not scream. She did not stagger. She stood exactly where she was, the wine running down her face, her cream dress stained at the collar, and looked at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her before and never wanted to see again. The expression of a woman having the last thing she had been hoping was not true confirmed in front of 15 people. "Get out of here!" Derek's voice had gone flat and stripped down to the bare, ugly mechanism underneath every performance he had put on all afternoon. "Go to the kitchen where you belong. What makes you think someone like you deserves a seat at this table?" The room went the kind of quiet that has physical weight. Margaret Henderson pressed herself back against the wall. Two women near the bar cart grabbed each other's arms without looking at each other. Mike Henderson had stopped breathing. I could see it in the stillness of his chest, the particular frozen quality of a man who has just witnessed something he cannot unknow. Lucas made a sound from the hallway entrance. Small, strangled. The sound a child makes when his brain encounters something it has no category for, something it will spend years trying to find words for and never quite manage. I looked at him. His face had gone the color of chalk. His hands were gripping the puzzle box so tightly his knuckles had gone white as the linen on the ruined table. I shook my head at him. One movement, small and absolute. Stay back. He understood, but his eyes were filling slow, terrible, the tears of a 10-year-old boy trying with everything he has to be brave in a room that should never have asked it of him. Emily did not move toward the kitchen. She stood in the center of that beautiful ruined room, with the wine drying on her face, and looked at the man she had married with. 10 years of accumulated clarity arriving all at once, the grief of it, the waste of it, the full crushing weight of every moment she had looked away from what was right in front of her. I looked at my daughter standing there. I looked at what was running down her face. I looked at what was in her eyes. Then I looked at my hands, these hands that had built 37 structures that still stood. That had held Sarah through 2 years of treatments. That had taught this woman beside me to ride a bicycle in a church parking lot on a Saturday morning, when the world had been smaller, and I had been able to fix everything in it. I reached out and picked up the watch from the table. I held it in my palm for one moment, felt the weight of it, the cracked crystal warm from the firelight. Then I put it in my shirt pocket, close to my chest, and I stood up. Not fast, not with anger, with the slow, complete certainty of a man who has finally, after 68 years and one long afternoon, run out of reasons to remain seated. "I'm not leaving Derek," I said. 3 words, quiet as a closing door. But something shifted in the room. The moment they landed, I felt it move through the air before I saw it register on any face. Henry Walker set his cup down with great deliberateness. Lucas straightened in the doorway. And Derek Collins, for the first time in this entire long afternoon, forgot to perform. 40 years ago, on the morning of our wedding, Sarah clasped this watch around my wrist in the hallway of her parents' house and told me it would remind me every single day of the man I had promised to be. Standing in the center of Derek Collins' living room, with 14 people staring at me, and the smell of spilled burgundy wine cutting through the wood, smoke and the candle wax, I understood for the first time what she had actually meant by that. Derek took a step toward me. "Old man wants to make a stand." His voice carried the dangerous lightness of a man who has run out of patience for a performance he had not expected to last this long. "Fine, make your stand. I've been waiting all afternoon for you to try." "I know you have," I said. He stopped. Something flickered in his face. He had not expected me to agree with him. People with Derek's particular brand of arrogance build their entire strategy around the assumption that the other person does not see them clearly. When you demonstrate that you do, it destabilizes them in ways they cannot immediately compensate for. "Derek." Henry Walker's voice came from behind me. Steady low, the voice of a man who has decided something. "I would think very carefully right now. It's stay out of this, Henry." "I don't think I will," Henry said. And the quiet certainty in those 5 words made 2 of the guests near the bar cart take an involuntary step backward. But Derek's eyes were on me. Only me. The room had contracted for him to the 2 of us, which told me everything I needed to know about where his real fear lived. Not in Henry, not in the guests, in me. In whatever he sensed in me that he had never been able to name or neutralize. "You want to tell me," he said, his voice dropping to something uglier and more private, "what exactly you think gives you the right to walk into my house and see your house?" I said. He blinked. "What?" "You said my house." I looked at him evenly. My voice was the same temperature it had been all afternoon, level, unhurried. "I want to make sure we're both clear on what that means." His jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm being direct, which is what you said you wanted, man to man." A vein had appeared along his left temple, pulsing with a slow, visible regularity. His hands had closed into loose fists at his sides, not raised, not threatening, just the automatic physical response of a man whose body was preparing for something his mind had not yet caught up to. In the hallway entrance, Lucas had stopped crying. He was standing very straight, his puzzle box held against his chest, watching his grandfather with an expression so concentrated and so serious that it looked borrowed from someone twice his age. I could see him memorizing this. I could see him storing it away in the place where a child keeps the things he will carry forward into the man he becomes. "William." Emily's voice came from across the room. Rough scraped the voice of a woman who has spent the last 10 minutes fighting back everything she feels. "Dad, you don't have to—" "Yes," I said gently without looking away from Derek. "I do." I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the watch. I held it in my open palm, the worn leather strap, the cracked crystal, the face that had looked up at me every morning for 4 decades. There was one thing Sarah had said to me, not on our wedding morning, but at the very end in a hospital room where every breath was a small, careful decision, her hand in mine, her voice finding just enough air. "Patience is not the same as permission, William, and when you finally understand the difference, you'll know. You won't need me to tell you." I had understood it tonight. I had understood it the moment Derek's wine hit Emily's dress. The moment Lucas made that small, strangled sound in the doorway. The moment Emily sat back down in her chair, with her hands shaking in her lap, and her dignity arranged across her face like a shield she had been carrying so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Patience was not this. Patience was not watching your daughter absorb damage in the name of keeping the peace. Patience was not sitting at the end of a table, while a man who owed you his entire career called you a burden. Patience was not letting a 10-year-old boy grow up, believing that this was how the men in his family behaved when someone they loved was being hurt. I closed my fingers around the watch, felt the weight of it, the warmth of the metal from my chest. 40 years, I said aloud, not to Derek, not to the room, to Sarah wherever she was, which I had decided years ago was somewhere close enough to hear. "I think I finally understand." Then I put the watch back in my pocket, and I looked at Derek Collins with the full undivided attention of a man who had spent the last 6 hours deciding to let this moment arrive. "You asked what I contribute," I said. "I'm going to answer that question, but first I need you to understand something." I took one step toward him, unhurried, deliberate, the step of a man who has stopped calculating. "The last time you had a door open for you in this business, the only time before that anyone believed in what you were building enough to put real money behind it. Do you remember who did that? The color began slowly to leave Derek Collins' face. "Because I do," I said. "I remember it very clearly." Derek's mouth opened, then it closed. Something was happening behind his eyes. The rapid, panicked recalculation of a man who has just realized that the ground he has been standing on is not solid, has never been solid, and that the person he chose to humiliate today was the same person who poured the foundation beneath him. "I'm not leaving," I said again, "and I am not done. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters. Not the way it looks in movies, not slow motion, not dramatic music swelling underneath. Real, fast, and over before most people in that room had fully understood what they were watching." Derek moved first. He came off the mantelpiece with his right shoulder dropping the instinctive body language of a man who has decided that words have run their course and physical force is the next available tool. He was broader than me by 30 pounds and 26 years younger, and he came in with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once been physically overmatched in his adult life. That confidence was the first thing that cost him. "Derek, don't," Henry started. Derek's right hand shot out toward my collar. A grab, not a punch. The move of a man who wants to control rather than strike, who wants to drag rather than hit, who wants to establish physical dominance the way he had been establishing social dominance all afternoon. I had been watching his shoulder since he left the mantelpiece. I had learned a long time ago working security on job sites where arguments between contractors sometimes became something more dangerous, that the shoulder always moves before the hand. The shoulder is where intention lives before it becomes action. You watch the shoulder, and you have an extra half second that the other person does not know they have given you. His fingers were 6 inches from my collar when I stepped, not back, not away. 45 degrees to the left, a small unhurried step, the kind that barely registers as movement until the person reaching for you discovers that they are reaching for air. His momentum carried him forward and slightly past me, his center of gravity pulled by the weight of his own aggression. I placed my left hand on the inside of his elbow, barely a touch, 4 pounds of pressure, just enough to guide the direction his own weight was already taking him. He went down on one knee, hard. The sound of it, that solid percussive contact with the hardwood floor, rang out across the room. "What the?" Derek gasped. He pushed himself up immediately the way men do when their pride moves faster than their judgment. His face had gone a dark mottled red, the particular color of a man whose body is running faster than his mind can manage. "You want to try that again?" I asked. My voice was level. My breathing had not changed. "Take your time." He threw a punch this time. A real one, right hand loaded from the shoulder, aimed at my face with everything he had behind it. I watched his shoulder. The punch was fast. But fast and readable are not the same thing, and Derek Collins had spent his entire adult life being the most physically imposing person in every room he entered. He had never needed to develop subtlety. He attacked in straight lines the way a man attacks when he has never had to attack someone who was paying attention. I turned my head 3 inches to the right. The punch went past my ear close enough that I felt the air of it against my cheekbone. His fist found nothing but the space where my face had been a quarter of a second earlier. His momentum pulled him forward again. He stumbled, catching himself against the armchair beside him, knocking it sideways. Margaret Henderson made a sharp, involuntary sound and pressed herself flat against the wall. "Derek!" Henry's voice from somewhere behind me, carrying the particular tone of a man who is watching something he predicted and takes no satisfaction in being right about. "Stop. Right now." Derek did not stop. He came again, both hands this time, reaching for my shoulders, wanting to use his weight and his height to simply overwhelm the geometry of the situation. It was not a technique. It was desperation dressed up as aggression. I waited until his hands were 8 inches from my shoulders. Then I dropped my weight, hips down, knees bent just enough to change my center of gravity, and turned into him instead of away. His hands closed on the front of my jacket, but I was already rotating, using the line of his own arms as a lever, redirecting his weight rather than opposing it. He went down for the second time. This time it was his shoulder and his hip, a full fall, and the sound of it was considerably more substantial than the first. He lay there for 2 full seconds, breathing hard. The expensive silk of his shirt had pulled loose from his trousers. His hair, which had been perfect all afternoon, had fallen across his forehead. He looked for the first time like a man rather than a performance. The room was completely still, not the held breath stillness of before, Something different, the stunned, recalibrating stillness of people who have just watched their understanding of a situation turn inside out. "Dad?" Lucas breathed from the doorway. The word came out barely above a whisper, carrying in it something I had not heard from my grandson before. Not fear, not excitement. Awe, pure, unguarded awe, the sound of a 10-year-old boy watching the version of his grandfather that nobody in this house had known, existed until 60 seconds ago. Derek pushed himself up to sitting. His chest was heaving. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared across his forehead, and his eyes, those controlled, calculating eyes that had been running the room all afternoon, were doing something I had not seen them do all day. They were uncertain. "What?" He started, his voice stripped of every performance quality down to the raw, unadorned thing underneath. "What the hell are you?" "I spent 12 years managing security on construction sites," I said. My voice was the same temperature it had been when I stood up from my chair. Large sites, multiple contractors, disputes that occasionally became physical. I learned what I needed to learn. I looked at him sitting on the floor of his own living room. "Are you hurt?" He stared at me. "Am I?" He stopped. "Are you seriously asking me if I'm hurt?" "Yes," I said. "I am, because you are still my daughter's husband and my grandson's father, and I did not come here today to injure anyone." I extended my hand toward him. "Can you get up?" He looked at my hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately categorize outside the boundaries of every script he had prepared. Then he looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, and I watched him understand in real time that every person in that room was now seeing him with completely different eyes than they had been using an hour ago. He did not take my hand. He got up on his own slowly and stood there in the center of his living room, with his shirt untucked and his hair wrong, breathing like a man who has just discovered that the world is organized differently than he believed. "You had no right," he said. His voice was shaking. "You had absolutely no right to—" "Henry," I said without looking away from Derek. "I think it's time." There is a particular silence that follows something no one in a room was prepared to see. Not uncomfortable silence, something more active than that. The sound of 14 people simultaneously revising every assumption they walked in, with every judgment they had formed over the course of an afternoon, every hierarchy they had accepted without examining. Derek stood in the center of his living room, with his shirt untucked and his composure in pieces on the floor around him. He was working at putting his face back together. I could see the effort of it, the way he straightened his spine and set his jaw and tried to locate the version of himself that had controlled this room 3 hours ago. He could not find it. That version was gone. "All right." His voice came out thicker than he intended, carrying a tremor he could not quite suppress. He cleared his throat, tried again. "All right. So the old man knows a few tricks. Good for him." He looked around the room, searching for the faces that had been on his side all afternoon, the nods and laughs and reflexive agreements. He found only people looking carefully at the middle distance at their shoes, at the abstract patterns in the Persian rug. "Doesn't change anything." He continued, his voice climbing toward its former register and not quite making it. "Doesn't change who he is, what he's built, what he's actually contributed to this family." "Dad." The voice came from the hallway entrance, small, clear, absolutely certain. Lucas walked into the center of the room. He was still holding the puzzle box against his chest, but his arms had dropped, slightly less defensive now, more deliberate. He stopped 6 feet from his father and looked up at him with those gray eyes that had always belonged on someone much older. "Grandpa never threw anything at Mom," he said. 7 words, spoken without heat, without drama, without the self-consciousness of a child who knows he is saying something important. Just a fact stated plainly in the particular tone of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right moment to say it and has decided this is the moment. The room stopped breathing. Derek stared at his son. For the first time all afternoon, his mouth opened and produced no sound. The jaw that had been working continuously for 3 hours, the voice that had filled every corner of this house with its opinions and its judgments and its performances of authority, fell silent with the complete total silence of a man who has just been disarmed by a 10-year-old and has absolutely no response prepared. "Lucas," Emily's voice broke. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and her eyes flooded, not with sorrow, I realized, but with the overwhelming chest-cracking relief of a woman who has just heard the truth, spoken out loud in her own home, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. Lucas looked at his mother. His chin trembled just once, a single involuntary quiver, and then steadied. "It's true, Mom," he said. "It's just true." "I know, baby." Emily's voice came out barely above a breath. "I know it is." Derek's hands opened and closed at his sides. The color that had flooded his face during the physical confrontation had receded entirely, leaving him a strange mottled gray, the color of a man whose body is processing something his mind has not caught up to. "That's Lucas, that is completely out of line." "Is it not true?" Lucas asked. The question hung in the room like smoke. Derek's mouth worked. "That is not the point." "Is it not true?" Lucas asked again. His voice did not rise. His eyes did not waver. He simply stood there, 10 years old in his chinos and his button-down shirt with the puzzle box against his chest, and waited for his father to answer a question that had no answer that would help him. Derek looked around the room, the desperate scanning look of a man checking for allies and finding none. Not Henderson, not Margaret, not any of the carefully cultivated relationships he had spent years constructing in rooms exactly like this one. Every face was turned away, or turned toward Lucas, with expressions ranging from discomfort to something that looked in several cases remarkably like respect for a child who had just done something most of the adults in the room had been unwilling to do. Henry Walker stepped forward. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has chosen his moment and is confident in it, 2 steps from where he had been standing, bringing him into the open space near the center of the room. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his glasses. He looked at Derek Collins with the measured, neutral expression of a man who has spent 40 years in conference rooms where the truth was the most dangerous thing anyone could bring to the table. "I think," Henry said, his voice carrying the full, quiet authority of someone who has never needed volume to be heard, "it is time that the people in this room knew exactly who they have been disrespecting this afternoon." Derek's head snapped toward him. "Henry, whatever you think you're about to say." "Bill." Henry looked at me. His eyes were steady and serious, and carried in them a kind of apology not for what he was about to do, but for the fact that it had taken this long in this room for anyone to do it. "May I?" My throat tightened. I pressed my back teeth together against it. Then I nodded. Henry turned back to the room. And in the quiet that followed, the absolute expectant quiet of 14 people, leaning slightly forward without knowing they were doing it, I felt something I had not felt in this house since the first time I had walked through its iron gate. I felt the weight of the truth preparing to land. Henry Walker has never been a man who wastes words. In 40 years of knowing him, I had watched him take apart arguments that teams of lawyers had spent months constructing, using nothing but the facts in the correct order, delivered at the correct pace. He did not perform. He did not dramatize. He simply said what was true, and he said it with the particular authority of a man who has never needed anyone's permission to tell the truth. What he did next was no different. He looked at the room, not at Derek, not at me, but at the guests arranged around the living room, like an audience that had not understood until now that they were one. Margaret Henderson, the Marshalls, the 2 couples near the bar cart whose names I had never learned. He looked at them with the calm, level gaze of a man who was about to give people information they should have had a long time ago. "This man," Henry said, and his voice carried with the absolute clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime making sure he is heard the first time, "has been sitting at the end of your table all afternoon." He paused not for effect, but to let the simple weight of that sentence settle. "His name is William Carter, and I think it is time that everyone in this room understood exactly who William Carter is." Derek took a step forward. "Henry, I am warning you." "You are welcome to warn me," Henry said pleasantly without looking at him. "I have been warned by considerably more formidable people than you. Derek and I am still standing." He turned back to the room. "William Carter founded Carter Construction in this state 31 years ago. He started with 1 crew, 1 second-hand truck, and a reputation for delivering exactly what he promised on exactly the day he promised it. He built that company into a regional firm with 412 employees at its peak." He let the number land. 37 completed projects, roads, bridges, public buildings, infrastructure that people in this state use every single day without knowing his name. A sound went through the room. Not words, just the collective intake of breath that happens when a number lands differently than expected. Mike Henderson had stopped looking at the carpet. His eyes were on Henry now, sharp and attentive, the eyes of a businessman recalculating. He sold the company 12 years ago. Henry continued his voice, holding its steady, unhurried pace. Not because he ran out of ideas, not because the market turned, because his wife was sick and he had made her a promise, and William Carter is a man who keeps his promises. Emily made a sound small, involuntary, the sound of someone being struck somewhere. They did not know they were still tender. She pressed both hands over her mouth this time, and her shoulders shook once, just once, before she pulled them still by sheer force of will. My own throat had closed. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through my nose and looked at a fixed point on the wall above the fireplace. The way I had learned to look at fixed points when the thing happening in the room was something I needed to survive rather than respond to. Now, Henry's voice shifted still level, but with something new entering it, something that had been patient all afternoon and was done being patient. He turned to look directly at Derek Collins. "You want to talk about self-made men at this table?" He let the echo of Derek's earlier toast hang in the air between them, for a moment, visible and damning. "You want to talk about building something real, about earning your place?" He tilted his head slightly. "Then let us talk about the first time anyone in this business believed in what you were building enough to back it with real capital." Derek's jaw was working. The color had left his face entirely, not the red of anger, but the gray-white of a man whose blood has suddenly had better places to be. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I have the county records," Henry said simply. "The original silent partner agreement on the Alexandria mixed-use development, $2.4 million, filed in 2014. I pulled it 3 weeks ago when I found out I would be sitting at this table today." He looked at Derek steadily. "Would you like me to tell the room whose signature is on that agreement? Or would you prefer to tell them yourself?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Derek looked at me. For the first time all day, the first time I realized in possibly years, he looked at me with his eyes fully open without the filter of performance or calculation or contempt. Just a man looking at another man and understanding with sudden terrible clarity something he had successfully avoided understanding for a very long time. "Dad!" Emily's voice was barely a sound. She was looking at me with her hands still pressed against her mouth, tears running freely down her face. Now, not sobs, just tears. The quiet, unstoppable kind that come when grief and gratitude arrive at exactly the same moment. "Dad, you?" Every pair of eyes in the room turned to me. I looked at my daughter, at the wine stain on her dress, at the tears on her face, at the 10 years of weight she had been carrying in the set of her shoulders, that I could see now, that I was looking at it directly. Had always been there, had been there since before I knew to look for it. "I didn't want you to know," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped across the edges of everything I had been holding back since the moment I walked through that iron gate. I wanted him to build something he could be proud of, something he could show you. I wanted you to be proud of what he had made. I stopped, looked at her. "I was wrong about what that would cost you." Emily's legs gave slightly, not a collapse, but the small, involuntary buckle of a woman whose body is registering something her mind is still catching up to. She caught herself against the arm of the sofa, her hand gripping the upholstery, knuckles white. "How much?" she asked. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking them is holding themselves together through the concentrated application of everything they have. "How much did you put in, Emily?" "Dad!" Her eyes met mine, red-rimmed, overflowing, absolutely direct. "How much?" Henry looked at me. I looked at my daughter. Then I said, the number I had not said out loud in 11 years. The room absorbed it the way rooms absorb things that are too large to process quickly, with a collective stillness. A collective breath held, and then slowly, carefully released. Derek put his hand against the wall. Not dramatically, the way a man puts his hand against a wall when he suddenly needs it to be there. His voice came out wrong, too high, too thin, stripped entirely of the resonance it had carried all afternoon. "You were the one who—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought it was a development fund. I thought it was institutional." "It was me," I said. "It was always me." Derek's hand slid down the wall slightly. He caught himself. He stood there in the center of the room he had built, with money he had accepted from a man he had spent years treating like furniture, and the expression on his face was something I had no satisfaction in seeing. Not humiliation, not rage, but the particular devastating blankness of a man who has just had the story he has been telling himself about his own life pulled out from underneath him. "Why," he said. The word came out small and cracked, barely recognizable, as coming from the same man who had filled this room all afternoon. "Why would you do that? And then, why would you just—" "Because Emily loved you," I said. "And because I believed at the time that you were worth what she saw in you." I held his gaze. "I have been waiting a long time to find out if I was wrong about that." Henry was not finished. I had known he would not be, had known it from the moment he stepped into the center of the room, from the particular set of his shoulders that I recognized from 40 years of watching him work. Henry Walker finished things. It was the quality that had made him indispensable in 3 decades of business and occasionally exhausting in friendship. And right now, standing in Derek Collins' living room with the remains of an afternoon scattered around us, it was the most valuable quality in the world. "There is one more thing," Henry said. His voice had not changed temperature. That was the thing about Henry. He was the same whether he was ordering coffee or dismantling a man's life in front of an audience. "I think the people in this room deserve to have a complete picture." Derek pushed off the wall. Whatever had broken open in him 30 seconds ago had been rapidly and perfectly patched by something that looked like anger but smelled like fear. "You are done," he said, his voice climbing back toward its former register and cracking on the way up. "You are done talking in my house? Collins Development." Henry said, speaking directly through Derek's objection as though it were weather, "has reported losses for 3 consecutive quarters. I want to be precise about what that means because I think precision matters here." He looked around the room, at the guests at Henderson, at the Marshalls, at the couples whose names I had never learned. "It means the company is not profitable. It has not been profitable since the spring of last year. 2 bridge loans have been taken from private lenders, not banks' private lenders, which tells you something about what the banks had already decided, at interest rates that are, to use a technical term, punishing." He paused. "There is also a pending lawsuit from a contractor in Phoenix, unpaid invoices totaling $340,000, filed 6 weeks ago." The sound that went through the room was different from any sound it had made before. Not a gasp, something more internal, more private. The sound of people revising their understanding of what they were looking at. Henderson set his glass down on the side table. He did not pick it up again. "You have no right," Derek said. His voice was shaking now, genuinely visibly. Shaking the tremor of a man who is discovering that the ground he has been standing on is made of paper. "That is proprietary business information, and you have absolutely no legal right to—" "Quarterly loss reports filed with the state are public record," Henry said. "The lawsuit is public record. The loan agreements registered as liens against the company's assets are public record." He looked at Derek with the calm, impartial expression of a man who has simply read what was available to be read. "I did not break any laws, Derek. I just did what anyone with a public records account in 40 minutes could have done." He paused. "The question is why no one in this room thought to do it before today." Derek turned to Emily. The shift in his focus was immediate and desperate. The move of a man who has lost the room and is pivoting to the person he has historically been able to control. "Emily," his voice dropped, went soft, went to the register he used when they were alone, and he wanted something. "Whatever Henry thinks he knows, I can explain all of it. The losses are temporary. The lawsuit is being handled. None of this is what it looks like." "The joint account," Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. She had stopped crying. Her hands were in her lap, and her back was straight, and her eyes were fixed on her husband, with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger, not grief, but the cold, absolute attention of a woman who has decided to stop managing her own understanding of her life and start looking at it directly. Derek blinked. "What?" "Our joint account." Emily's voice did not rise. It did not waver. It was the steadiest thing in the room. "The one in both our names. There have been transfers out of it. I noticed them 3 months ago, and you told me they were vendor payments for the business." She looked at her husband. "How much of what Henry just described have you been covering with that account?" The room had gone the particular still of people who understand they are witnessing something private and cannot look away. Derek's mouth opened. "Emily, this is not the time or the place to—" "It is exactly the time," she said. "And it is exactly the place. Because you chose this place, Derek. You chose today. You chose to do what you did in front of these people, and now the truth is going to happen in front of these people too." Her jaw was set and her hands were flat on her knees, and she was trembling. I could see it from across the room, the fine, full-body trembling of a woman running on something purer and more dangerous than composure. "How much?" Derek looked around the room one final time. The scan of a man checking his exits and finding them all blocked not by force, but by the simple, immovable fact that the people he had spent years cultivating as his audience had shifted quietly and completely into something else. Henderson cleared his throat. He looked at his wife. She looked at him. A conversation happened in that look, brief, complete, requiring no words. "We should get going," Henderson said. He said it to the room, not to Derek. He was already reaching for his jacket. The marshals stood, then the couple near the bar cart, then the other two. Not in a rush, carefully the way people leave a place when they want to make it clear that the leaving is a choice, not a retreat. Not one of them looked at Derek when they went. Not one. Derek stood in the center of his living room and watched the people he had built his entire afternoon around quietly remove themselves from it. And the expression on his face I had not expected, this had not braced fear. It was not rage. It was not defiance. It was the naked, unguarded devastation of a man watching the version of himself he had most carefully constructed simply cease to exist in other people's eyes. In the corner, Lucas sat on the floor with his puzzle box in his lap. He had worked 3 more panels free while the adults talked. He looked up at his grandfather, and his gray eyes were serious and sad and very, very old for 10. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "is it going to be okay?" My throat tightened so hard, I had to wait 2 full seconds before I could trust my voice. "Yes, buddy," I said. "It's going to be okay." I did not know yet exactly how, but I knew who was going to make it so. I did not follow Emily upstairs. Some things a person has to find on their own, and some doors once opened cannot be closed again. I had learned that over 68 years, in the particular way that men learn things, by making the wrong choice, first by opening doors I should have left closed, and leaving closed ones I should have opened by accumulating enough errors to eventually recognize the shape of a decision before I made it. This was Emily's door. Her hands needed to be the ones to open it. I sat down on the sofa in the living room. Lucas came and settled beside me without being asked, the natural, unthinking closeness of a child who has had a difficult afternoon and needs to be near something solid. He had worked 7 panels free from the puzzle box. He held it in both hands and turned it slowly, feeling for the 8th the way I had taught him, with his fingertips rather than his thumbs. Henry had gone to the kitchen to make coffee. I heard the familiar domestic sounds of it, water running, cabinet opening, the quiet industry of a man who understands that the most useful thing he can do right now is give other people space and hot coffee. Upstairs I heard Emily's footsteps, slow at first, then quicker, then the sound of a drawer opening, then quiet. "Grandpa," Lucas said without looking up from the box. "Where did Dad go?" "He needed some air," I said. Derek had left 20 minutes ago out the front door without a word, his car pulling out of the driveway with the particular speed of a man who needs to be somewhere else before he figures out where that somewhere is. Lucas considered this. "He does that sometimes," he said. "Goes for drives when he's upset." He turned the puzzle box over in his hands. "Mom does the opposite. She goes upstairs." I looked at my grandson. "You notice a lot. You notice things when the adults around you are careful about what they say." He glanced up at me, quick, honest, the eyes of a child who has been reading rooms since before he had the vocabulary for what he was reading. "I've been noticing for a long time." My chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with age or injury. I put my arm around his shoulders and pulled him against my side, and he leaned in without resistance the way he had when he was 3 years old, and the world had been smaller and simpler, and I had been able to fix every problem in it. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry you had to." He leaned his head against my arm. "It's not your fault, Grandpa." We stayed like that, the boy and the old man on the sofa, with the evening pressing in through the windows and the house settling around us into a quiet that felt for the first time all day like something other than held breath. 40 minutes later, Emily came down the stairs. She was carrying a manila folder, and her phone and her face had the particular quality of someone who has been crying and has finished and has no intention of starting again. Not composed, that was not the right word. Resolved. Her eyes were red and slightly swollen, but her jaw was set in the way it had been set since she was 4 years old, and something had made her angry enough to stop being sad about it. She sat down in the armchair across from me. She set the folder on the coffee table and her phone face down beside it. She looked at me for a moment, just looked the way people look at someone when they are putting together a sentence that needs to be exactly right. The refinancing, she said, 3 years ago, when the rates were bad and Derek said he had found a private lender who was giving us favorable terms. She looked at the folder. That was you. I did not say anything right away. I watched my daughter's face and gave her the space to finish what she needed to say. The medical bills from my surgery 2 years ago. Derek said the insurance covered most of it and we were handling the rest. Her voice was absolutely steady, which told me exactly how much effort it was costing her. That was you too. Emily, Lucas's school? Her voice cracked on her son's name just once, just a hairline fracture sealed almost before it opened. The tuition increase last fall. Derek said he had restructured the payment plan with the school directly. She opened the folder, turned it toward me. He restructured it with your money, Dad. There are transfers here going back 4 years, routed through an LLC that Derek set up. I didn't even know it existed. I looked at the papers. My own signature in the careful block letters I had used for 40 years of contracts. The amounts, the dates. 4 years of quiet transactions each one made because I had found out through Henry, through a contact at the school, through the particular sixth sense that parents never fully lose that my daughter needed something, and her husband was not providing it and was too proud and too calculated to let anyone know. How did you... She stopped, pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were bright again, but her voice held. How did you know I never told you any of this? You didn't have to tell me, I said. You're my daughter. I've been watching you for 38 years. I know what it looks like when you're managing something you shouldn't have to manage alone. A sound escaped her, not a sob, something smaller and more broken than a sob. The sound of a woman who has been told something she needed to hear so badly that hearing it causes physical pain. She pressed her fist against her sternum, hard, like she was trying to hold something in place. Why didn't you say anything? Her voice came out rough. Why didn't you just tell me? Ask me, let me know that you knew. Because you would have been ashamed, I said. And you had nothing to be ashamed of. And I was not going to be the reason you felt it. Emily covered her eyes with both hands. Her shoulders shook once, twice, 3 times. And then she pulled her hands down and straightened the way Carter women had always straightened when they had decided that falling apart was not going to serve them. There's something else, she said. She picked up her phone. The drawer was locked. I've had a spare key for 2 years. I made a copy after he locked it the first time and never told him. She turned the phone toward me. On the screen was an app I did not recognize, a home security interface, a grid of camera feeds. He had cameras installed 8 months ago. He told me they were for the security system. She tapped the screen. They're connected to cloud storage. 3 months of footage. Her jaw tightened. I only watched 20 minutes. I looked at my daughter's face as she said it. I looked at what 20 minutes of footage had put behind her eyes. Emily. My voice came out rough and low. Are you all right? She looked at me, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing I had ever seen on a human being. Pain and fury and grief, and something that was just beginning, at the very edges, to look like relief. I'm going to be, she said. I think for the first time in a long time, I actually think I'm going to be. She reached out across the coffee table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were cold and they were trembling, but her grip was firm. I need to make a phone call, Dad, she said, and then I need you to stay. I'm not going anywhere, I told her. She nodded once. Then she picked up her phone and walked toward the kitchen, and I heard her voice through the doorway, quiet, steady, asking to speak with someone about a consultation on Monday morning. Lucas looked up from the puzzle box. The 8th panel had come free in his hands. He stared at it for a moment, then looked at me with those gray eyes. Is Mom okay? He asked. I watched my daughter through the kitchen doorway, her back straight, her voice level, her hand not shaking on the phone. She's going to be better than okay, I said. She just needed to remember that she could be. He came back at 7 o'clock. I heard his key in the lock before Emily did old habit, the automatic alertness of a man who has spent decades arriving at job sites before the crew and learning to hear what approaches before it arrives. The particular scrape of that specific key in that specific lock, the half-second pause before the handle turned, which told me he was standing on the other side of the door collecting himself. Emily heard it a moment later. I watched her sit up straighter, not with fear I realized, with readiness. There was a difference, and the difference was everything, and I had not seen that particular posture on my daughter in longer than I could accurately calculate. Derek came through the door and stopped. The living room was quieter than he had left it. The last of the candles had burned low. The Thanksgiving table was visible through the archway, the remnants of the meal, the centerpiece listing slightly the linen napkins discarded. The house that had been a performance 3 hours ago was now just a house, and Derek Collins, standing in the doorway of it, looked for the first time all day like a man who was not sure where he belonged in it. He looked at Emily. He looked at me. He looked at the manila folder on the coffee table. Something moved across his face fast, calculated the rapid reorientation of a man who has spent his drive recalibrating his approach. The anger was gone. Or rather, it had been put away, filed under things that were not going to be useful tonight, and replaced with something more controlled, more dangerous in a different way. Emily. His voice was soft, the voice he used when they were alone and he wanted something. I think we need to talk. Yes, Emily said. We do. He came into the room and sat down, not in his usual chair at the head of the arrangement, I noticed, but on the sofa, across from Emily, closer to her level, a calculated adjustment. He looked at me briefly, then back at his wife. William, I appreciate you being here for Emily today. I think it might be best if she and I had some privacy to... He stays, Emily said. Derek's jaw tightened by a fraction. He smoothed it immediately. Of course that's fine. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loose, the body language of openness of a man with nothing to hide, performed by a man with everything to hide. Emily, I know it got out of hand. I know I said things that were... He stopped, recalibrated. I've been under enormous pressure. The business, the loans, things I should have told you about and didn't, because I was trying to handle it myself, and I didn't want you to worry. $84,000, Emily said. Derek blinked. What? From our joint account. Her voice was level as poured concrete. Over 4 years, averaging just over $20,000 per year. I went back through the statements tonight. She looked at her husband with the calm, devastating attention of a woman who has stopped being afraid of what she might find and has found it. How much of that went to cover the business losses? Derek's carefully constructed openness flickered. Emily, that money was... There were operational needs. There were periods where cash flow was... How much, Derek? He looked at her. He looked at the folder. He made one more calculation. I could see but the rapid assessment of a man deciding whether the truth or a version of it served him better, and then his shoulders dropped by a fraction. Most of it, he said. Most of it went to the business. Emily nodded. One slow, precise nod. The nod of a woman filing information in the place where she keeps things she will not forget. And my father's investment, she said. The $2.4 million in 2014. Did you know it was him when you accepted it? The question landed like a stone in still water. Derek looked at his hands. At the time, the paperwork went through a third-party administrator, and I didn't know the specific... Derek, Emily's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Did you know? He was quiet for 3 full seconds, then, yes. The word cost him something. I could see it in the way he said it, the particular deflation of a man releasing something he had been holding up through sheer sustained effort for a very long time. Emily pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a woman who has arrived after a long journey at the last question she needs answered before she can move forward. Were you ever going to tell me any of this? Derek looked at his wife, and in his eyes, stripped now of every performance, every calculation, every carefully maintained version of himself, I saw something I had not expected to see. Not defiance, not calculation. The raw, unguarded face of a man who knows he has lost something he cannot recover, and is only beginning to understand what it was worth. I kept thinking I could fix it, he said. His voice had gone rough. I kept thinking if I could just turn the numbers around, close one more deal, get through this quarter, I kept thinking you would never have to know, and things would be fine, and... He stopped. His throat worked. I know that doesn't... I've already called my lawyer, Emily said. The sentence was quiet. 5 words. They landed in the room with the absolute finality of something that cannot be unsaid. Derek's head came up. The rawness in his face shifted, replaced by something sharper, more frightened. Emily, I have an appointment Monday morning. She held his gaze. "I think you should find somewhere to stay tonight." "You cannot be serious." His voice climbed. "You are going to blow up our family over—" "You blew it up," she said. "Today, in front of 14 people, and in that locked drawer upstairs over the last 4 years." She stood, her legs held. I had been watching for it, the trembling, the uncertainty, and her legs held completely. "I am not blowing anything up. I am looking at what is already broken and deciding not to pretend it isn't." Derek turned to me, the last move of a man who has exhausted his other options. His eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, and younger than I had ever seen them, the eyes of the 32-year-old who had sat across a desk from me 11 years ago, and told me about his vision, with his hands shaking and his voice full of the specific hunger of someone who has not yet learned to perform confidence. "William." His voice cracked on my name. "Please, talk to her. You know what divorce does to a family. You know what it does to a kid. Is that what you want for Lucas?" I looked at Derek Collins for a long moment. I thought about the man he had been at 32. I thought about the man he had become. I thought about the gap between those two things, and all the choices that had created it. Then I stood up. I walked to Emily's side, and I stood there not between her and Derek, not shielding her. Just beside her, the way a father stands beside a daughter who does not need protection anymore, but deserves to know she is not standing alone. "That," I said quietly, "is a conversation for Monday. Tonight I think you should go." After the door swung shut behind him, something changed inside the house. Something fundamental and atmospheric, like a pressure system, finally breaking after days of building. The silence before had been dense, loaded, the particular kind of quiet that gathers inside walls holding too much. Now that silence gave way to something softer, something that moved. Even the candles on the dining room table seemed to respond, their flames, which had been leaning sideways all evening, bending away from some invisible current, slowly straightening, burning clean and calm and tall. I stood in place for a moment, my hand resting on the back of the sofa, my gaze fixed on that closed door. Whatever had been filling this room for hours had walked out with him. I could still feel the shape of it, like the outline left by an object long after the object itself is gone. Then Emily turned to face me. Her expression stopped me. In all my years of knowing her face, from the moment it was red and new and furious at the world, through every chapter that came after, I had never seen her wear anything quite like what she wore now. It was grief, yes, but not only grief. It was exhaustion layered under something fragile and newly formed, something that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Not relief, not quite, but the very first tentative direction toward relief, like the moment just before dawn when the sky hasn't brightened yet, but the darkness has begun its retreat. "Dad!" Her voice broke cleanly down the center of that single word, splitting it open. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry for all of it. Come here," I said. She came. She crossed the space between us, and I opened my arms, and she walked into them, pressing her face hard against my shoulder. And then she cried. Not the measured, restrained tears she had managed throughout the afternoon, the kind that are carefully edited for an audience, but the other kind, the real kind, the tears that originate somewhere deep below the surface, somewhere that doesn't have language, somewhere that has simply been waiting for a very long time for someone to give it permission. Her shoulders shook against my chest. Her fingers gripped the back of my jacket like she was holding on against a current. I did not speak. There are moments when words are exactly the wrong instrument, when what a person needs is not comfort in language, but comfort in presence and solidity, in the simple fact of another body saying, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." I held her and gave her everything I had. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, her face flushed and unguarded. She looked wrecked. She looked for the first time all day entirely like herself. "I spent years telling myself it wasn't that bad," she said, dragging the back of her hand across her cheeks. Years making excuses for him, rewriting things in my head, deciding that what I'd seen wasn't really what I'd seen. Years, Dad. "I know," I said. "But why didn't you push harder?" Her voice caught the edge of something sharper, not accusation exactly, but something close to it. The raw version of a question she had probably been carrying for longer than she realized. "Why didn't you sit me down and make me understand?" I looked at her, my daughter 38 years old, standing in what remained of her carefully assembled afternoon, the fabric of her dress crumpled, her careful composure entirely gone. Sometimes a thing has to come undone before it can be put together correctly. Because you weren't ready," I said. And because I believed in you enough to know that you would get there on your own. That's the only way it works when it comes from inside. I paused and my own voice buckled slightly under what I needed to say next. But I should have made it clearer that I was here. I should have made absolutely sure you knew the door was open. She pressed her lips together. Her chin trembled with the effort of keeping herself together. She would have known, Emily said quietly. Mom would have had the right words. She always did. I let that sit for a moment, the familiar ache of it, the way her name still moves through me after all these years. Not like a wound anymore, but like the memory of one. Still present, still felt, but survived. Your mother told me something once, I said. She said that strong women fall for the wrong person exactly once. She said it wasn't the falling that mattered. It was the people waiting when they finally found their way back. The ones who stayed. I met Emily's eyes. I am here. I have been here every single day, and I will keep being here. She broke again, not dramatically, not with any noise, but completely and quietly, the way the most complete things often happen. She leaned her forehead against my shoulder, and I held her again, and we stood there in the slowly settling air of that house in the candlelight that had finally stopped trembling. Then we heard it, the small, deliberate sound of feet on the staircase. Lucas appeared in the doorway wearing his pajamas. His hair was pressed flat on one side from where he had been lying down, and he had his puzzle box tucked carefully under his arm. He looked at his mother. He looked at me. His face did the thing it always did, ran through some rapid private calculation, processing what he saw with a seriousness that still surprised me in a 10-year-old, the way it had surprised me since he was very small. Is it over? He asked. Emily released a breath and held out her arm. Come here, baby. He crossed the room without hesitation and folded himself against her side, and she pulled him close and pressed her mouth to the top of his head. He let her hold him. He was 10 years old, and it had been a long, strange, heavy day, and he was still young enough to know, without embarrassment, that sometimes you simply need your mother's arms around you. Some things remain simple even inside the most complicated of circumstances. He looked up at me from beneath her arm, and then he held out the puzzle box. I looked down at it. Every one of the 16 panels had been released. Every interlocking mechanism had been solved. The box lay open in his small hands, completely and perfectly unlocked, each piece resting exactly where it was supposed to rest. The whole structure revealed nothing, hidden, nothing held back. I finished it, he said. My eyes burned. I couldn't speak for a moment. I pressed my thumb against the watch on my wrist. The watch that was back where it belonged now. Back on my wrist, where Sarah had fastened it 40 years ago, on a morning I have never stopped carrying with me. I felt the familiar weight of it. The cracked crystal was warm from my skin. Yes, you did, I managed. You absolutely did. And standing there in that room, my daughter's arms around her son, the candles burning straight and calm on the table, the house breathing freely. For the first time in years, I understood something I had always known, but had never felt so completely, that the locks we cannot open ourselves are often opened by someone we didn't know was working on them, and that the watch on my wrist, the boy in my daughter's arms, and the fragile new quiet filling this house were all in their own way the same thing. Evidence that some things given enough time and love do eventually come undone and open. 3 weeks is not a long time. In the broad arithmetic of a life, it barely registers a handful of mornings, a few dozen meals, the ordinary accumulation of days that pass without announcing themselves. And yet, sometimes 3 weeks is precisely the right amount of time. Sometimes it is exactly long enough for the things that needed to begin to quietly, carefully begin. Emily called me on the Monday evening after Thanksgiving. She had spent the day in consultation with a lawyer, and I could hear it in her voice, that specific characteristic flatness that settles over a person who has spent 8 hours doing something simultaneously necessary and exhausting, something that requires a particular kind of courage precisely because it offers no immediate relief. The process, she told me, was going to take time. These things always did. But then her voice shifted, found something beneath the flatness, something solid. For the first time in a long time, she said, I actually know what I want, Dad. I know. I told her I was proud of her. She told me not to make her cry again because she had run out of tissues somewhere around mid-afternoon and hadn't replaced them. We stayed on the phone for an hour, and when we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while, in the quiet, holding the feeling of it. The following Thursday, Henry sent me a short email. He wrote that 2 of Derek's primary business partners had quietly withdrawn from a joint development project. Not because of anything William had done, Henry was careful to note, simply because word moves through an industry the way water moves through old walls. Finding every crack, and nobody with a functioning instinct for self-preservation chooses to structure a serious deal with a man who throws wine at his wife in front of 15 witnesses. Colin's development, the email mentioned, had retained a restructuring consultant. Derek had relocated to a furnished apartment in Arlington. The ColDev license plate, according to someone who would know, had been surrendered back to the DMV. I read the email twice slowly, and then I set my phone down on the table. I had expected to feel satisfaction, the clean, conclusive kind that arrives when something long overdue finally rights itself. But what I felt was quieter than that, more settled. The particular internal stillness of a man who watches consequences find their natural destination and understands with genuine peace that he never needed to be the one to deliver them. On the first Friday of December, I picked Lucas up from school. He came through the doors and across the parking lot with his backpack bouncing and his puzzle box tucked under his arm, the box that was showing real signs of wear. Now the edges softened and the surface marked from weeks of daily handling. Emily had told me he'd been working with it every single day, locking and unlocking it over and over, drilling the sequence into his fingers until he could run through all 16 panels in under a minute. He climbed into the passenger seat, buckled his seatbelt with the automatic efficiency of a child who has been told about seatbelts approximately 10,000 times, and looked at me with those steady, serious gray eyes. "Grandpa," he said, "can we build something with real wood?" Something shifted in my chest, expanded slowly, and with a faint ache the way sensation returns to a part of the body that has gone numb and is learning to feel again. I looked at him. "What do you want to build?" He furrowed his brow and considered the question with the kind of genuine, unhurried concentration that most adults have long since abandoned in favor of faster answers. "I don't know yet," he finally said, "but something that lasts." I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. "Then we'll figure out the what as we go," I said. "That's usually how it works." He nodded once, a single satisfied nod, the matter settled, and turned to look out at the December trees moving past the window. On the third Sunday of December, I drove to the park near Emily's house. It was the park with the long grass slope that Lucas had been throwing himself down since he was 4 years old, back when the primary requirements for joy were a hill and momentum. Emily was already there when I came across the grass, sitting on the bench at the bottom of the slope, with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her face tilted upward toward the pale, thin winter sun. She looked different than she had on Thanksgiving. I noticed it immediately, and then took a moment to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't happiness, it was far too soon for happiness, and Emily had always been too fundamentally honest a person to perform an emotion she hadn't yet earned. But there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before, the specific, unmistakable lightness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, at great cost, set it down, and is only now beginning to discover what their own body feels like without the weight of it. Lucas spotted me coming from halfway up the slope and immediately launched himself downhill at full speed, arms spread wide, yelling something I couldn't decipher over the cold December wind. I planted my feet and leaned forward and caught him, and he laughed that big, open, completely unguarded laugh that always made him self-conscious in crowded rooms, the one he tried to muffle and shrink when there were people around to hear it. Out here, there was no one, just the gray sky and the dead grass and the cold air, and his laugh went out into all of it without apology. I set him down, and he turned immediately and ran back up the slope, already calculating the angle of his next run. I sat down beside Emily. Without a word or a glance, she held out her coffee, and I took it and drank and handed it back. She had been doing that since she was old enough to make coffee, offering it the way other people offer a hand, as an instinct rather than a decision. "How are you?" I asked. "Getting there," she said. "Some days move faster than others." She kept her eyes on Lucas, who had reached the top of the hill and was now standing with his arms out against the pale sky, preparing himself. "He's been sleeping better since Derek moved out." Her voice stayed level and matter-of-fact, but her jaw tightened for just a moment, a brief, involuntary contraction before she let it go. I didn't realize how much the house had been holding its breath. I pressed my hand over the watch on my wrist, felt its familiar weight, the cracked crystal warm from my skin, even in the cold. "Sarah would be proud of you," I said. Emily looked down at her coffee. Her eyes went bright for just a moment, quick and controlled, the tears of a woman who has decided she is allowed to feel things fully without being destroyed by them. She'd probably say I should have seen it sooner. She would say you saw it exactly when you were ready to, I said. That's what she always said. Emily leaned her head against my shoulder briefly, just the weight of it for a single moment, barely longer than a breath. Then Lucas came screaming down the hill at maximum velocity and crashed into the bench between us, completely breathless and grinning and loudly demanding that someone time his next attempt, with a proper phone and a proper stopwatch, because approximating didn't count. I pulled out my phone and opened the timer, and I thought about Sarah. I thought about patience and about the particular kind of love that knows when to speak and when to simply wait. I thought about all the years between then and now, and about a small boy who had unlocked a 16-panel puzzle box. Not by forcing it, but by learning to feel for the places where things wanted to move. Some things cannot be built in a single day. That much I knew. But they can be built slowly, honestly, one difficult conversation at a time, one quiet Sunday at a time, one shared cup of coffee passed between two people without needing to ask. That I thought watching Lucas crest the hill again, with his arms spread wide against the winter sky, was more than enough to begin. I have told you this story the way it happened. Not to make myself look like a hero, I was not one. I was a father who waited too long, who confused patience with permission, who let the people he loved absorb damage in the name of keeping a peace that was never real. If I could go back, I would have spoken sooner. Not with anger, not with force, just with honesty. That is the lesson I carry from that Thanksgiving afternoon, that family betrayal does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes slowly, dressed in silence and small surrenders, until one day you look up and realize you have been disappearing for years. I believe God puts the right moments in front of us at the right time. That evening, He put the truth in the mouth of a 10-year-old boy and the courage in the hands of a woman who had forgotten she possessed it. I was simply the man who finally stopped getting out of the way. Do not do what I did. Do not wait until a wine glass hits your daughter's face before you find your voice. Family betrayal is a slow erosion, and the people who love you should never have to face it alone. If someone in your life is being diminished, speak. The right word at the right time costs nothing and saves everything. This has been our family story, imperfect, painful, and still being written. Every family story worth telling is. And every instance of family betrayal worth surviving leaves behind something stronger than what it broke. If any part of this story touched something in you, leave a comment below and tell me. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that dignity is worth defending, subscribe to this channel so we never lose each other. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain certain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and understanding. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. Step away. Find what speaks to your heart and take good care of yourself.